Joe, thanks for being here today. I've been so intrigued by your work and I can't wait to get into it. So, your book, Decoding Cody, looks at non-speaking autistic communicators who use spelling. And in a minute, I'd love to ask you to explain what spelling is and how that works. But to start, can you give us a little background on yourself? I understand you have a background as a lawyer and you're now a pastor, correct?
Right. Well, thanks. And first, it's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation, Natalie, and looking forward to it. So, yeah, my background, I'm originally from New York. I was a litigator there and was in private practice for a while as a litigator and transitioned a little bit back then to working with organizations that were defending religious liberty, kind of constitutional issues, and I was representing and still do a lot of churches and nonprofits, and then got an invitation in 2003 to join Alliance Defending Freedom. So we moved from New York to the well, that's an understatement, to the blistering summers of Scottsdale, Arizona. And I was at ADF for about 18 years. I oversaw their what we called Allied Attorney Network. These were lawyers who didn't necessarily specialize in these cases, but we were able to kind of, teach and instruct and co-counsel with them. So that was the second stage of my life. And last 5-6 years, I've been pastoring and writing and just generally enjoying life.
That's great. So let's get into spelling. Can you tell us what spelling is for listeners who are new to this?
Yeah, so spelling is a part, broadly speaking, of what experts refer to as augmented communication. There are a number of forms of it. When I first stumbled into this, I was using the terminology incorrectly. And I fortunately have friends who are in that world and they've been tutoring me. So I'm getting a better idea of it. But so spelling, let's start with this. There are certain types of diagnoses where we've assumed incorrectly that people don't really have much mental capacity. We seem to have a built-in bias as people that when someone's not able to speak in a familiar way, that there must be the absence of intellect. Now, we know that that's not the case. Stephen Hawking reached a point of his life where he was contemplating black holes but couldn't tell you about it and used a communication device. So augmented forms of communication are just other ways that people who can't speak have a way of getting their thoughts out. And spelling is one form of that. When spelling started, there was a type of spelling that was referred to as facilitated communication, where spelling coaches would work with spellers and help them to get their arms and their fingers moving to get to a letter board and spell things. Because it turns out autism affects, I'm going to generalize terribly, affects fine motor skills, but in different ways. Some people can use a keyboard, some people can't. And they use, by the way, the term non-speaking, not non-verbal. The reason they do this is felt it's more accurate, because often somebody with non-speaking autism can say a word or a couple words or use sentence fragments. It's just their speech is not reliable where they can communicate that as a primary means of expressing themselves. So again, it's very different. Some people have almost no language. Others have kind of halfway there. Autism is a spectrum. So it's, of course, looks different in every case. And part of it depends on, sort of age and parental support and things like that. So spelling, though, ultimately is the individual with autism learns to cut new neural circuits, and they teach their hand and their body to respond, where they lift a hand, or sometimes they'll hold an implement like a pencil, and they'll have a board which is about the size of the screen of your laptop with the letters of the alphabet printed on it, and they will go to those letters. It's a little halting at first, but they tend to get smoother with it with time, and they'll spell out what they want to say. They do so with surprising accuracy. They use big words. They're polysyllabic, and there's even a delete key, and it's a kind of slow going process at times, but that's the general gist of it. And I'll just add one little PS, because some people will hear that and they might say, "Oh, wait a minute, I heard about spelling. That was discredited a long time ago." And that's simply not the case. That's old information. The early forms of spelling, going back to the 90s or so, had some criticism, some of it justified, because sometimes a person with significantly in the autism spectrum cannot feel their limbs. They lose. They literally don't have a sense that their arms or legs are there. So there were efforts to put counter pressure against them and hold a person's arm while they were moving. Well, if there's a hand on the arm, that creates the obvious question: are you guiding that hand over to the letters? And the other thing that complicated it was people were unable to reproduce it if it wasn't the trusted spelling facilitator, they call themselves. If a third party came in and said, okay, answer this, it didn't work. So they assumed, okay, this is not really happening. And that got repeated often enough that it became dogma for a while. Schools thankfully did not give up on it. University of Virginia's Department of Psychiatry deserves a medal for their perseverance. Now, many other universities have verified that these types of augmented communication work and are effective, and they've corrected. There's no more holding arms or things. They don't ask leading questions. They addressed it in ways to, kind of respond to those initial criticism. And now if you see, and I've been in hundreds of sessions at this point, you can see it's clearly the individual spelling what he or she is thinking. There's no question. So more universities have picked up on that, to the point that UC Berkeley is actually admitting students now with non-speaking autism who communicate by spelling. You need a lot of patience. You and I are talking. A typical spelling session, just picture the laborious process of pointing B, C, D, and so on. So you need patience, but we know that they're in there, and this is now being verified, in studies and at Syracuse University, Boston University, Vanderbilt, and many others. But those older criticisms persist, as spelling has really been shown to be accurate. I included a appendix in the book Decoding Cody, just addressing that. I felt like, okay, people need to see, and understand that information's outdated.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, like, how recent is spelling? Is it a fairly new, I guess, phenomenon that people are realizing, hey, they can use spelling to communicate?
Yeah, it is. It's really only a few decades. And there are not many places training people on how to be a spelling facilitator. There are maybe a half dozen groups. There's a website called spellers.com that, if any of your listeners who are curious, that lists some of the spelling groups. You can see what spelling boards look like, and there's a lot of resources. They try to keep research more or less current there under their resources. So it's all fairly new. One of the most common questions that I get, Natalie, is, please help me. I live in Wichita, Kansas, or, Tampa, Florida. And where do I find someone? We need to train more people to understand how to be a spelling facilitator. And this is a key point to it. It's not a purely mechanical thing. The spellers all say it's easier with someone whom they trust. There's something about the relationship. I don't know, maybe think of it like a relationship between a psychologist, a therapist, and a patient. There's certain relationships that work and some that don't. Spellers seem to also be able to pick up thoughts of people, and that's a more complex subject that was popularized on the telepathy tapes. And that absolutely happens, there's no question. But because of that, if they're with somebody who's skeptical, like, "Oh, I don't believe this, I'll hold this up and see what they do," it just doesn't work as well. There's a personalized element to it. And I'm explaining things in a general way because I feel like I'm a guide in a strange land. I feel like I've entered a room in a house, and I'm trying to describe what I see. And it keeps occurring to me, wait, there's another dozen rooms. Wait, there's 100 more rooms. And so it's much more complex than what I'm saying, but I'm trying to give generalizations from what I've picked up so far.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, it's all so interesting. Tell us about Cody. When did you first meet him, and what drew you into his story in particular?
Yeah, yeah. So I've known Cody since he was a little boy. He now stands 6'5", and he's a gentle giant. His parents are very, very close friends. And, part of what I say in the beginning of the book is I still regret the years that I greeted him with silly fist bumps and "How are you, Cody?" And I just assumed that there was not any I assumed he was functioning in the level of a 6-year-old or something like that. And tragically, this is very common. Um, a lot of the young men and women I've met with autism, it started with 4 in my church who were also seeing into the spiritual world. And now I've met a lot more. We have a large special needs ministry, one of the largest in the Phoenix Valley. And as I've connected with other churches and places and spellers, what happens is someone with that autism has this kind of brain body disconnect, and they'll tend to repeat things in their immediate environment. So they would be shown, for example, Barney videos. And then they have this compulsive behavior and they go, Barney, Barney. Oh, look at that. Billy likes Barney. Let's show him more Barney. Barney, Barney. And the sad part of that was while they were saying it, they hated it. I have many conversations with spellers now where they say, I hate those videos. Stop it. They're for kids. The 4 main spellers I got to know in my church, and they were all from like maybe 17, 18 to 25, are interesting stories. They all went from those videos. Cody's let me know that he's interested in politics. He's interested in World War II. I've given him books on World War II. Matthew loves architecture and building. Gracie loves art. My favorite is Elsa, who I'm so fond of. She's like a granddaughter. She and her mom were with me. I spoke at a conference in Orlando a few weeks back, and they came and Elsa did spelling for people there. Elsa went from, Elmo and Barney videos to telling us I like chemistry and math. I've memorized the periodic table in chemistry. I'd like to study the brain. So that's that's what's been happening. And that's what first drew me to Cody. When I found out he was there and he was spelling, I was amazed. Nobody knew anything about the spiritual part of it. I just wanted to meet him, just on a purely human and pastoral level. I thought, oh my goodness, I've known him all these years. I want to find out who he is. I want to talk to him. Does he want prayer for anything? So I was just fascinated on that level. And it shouldn't have been as much of a surprise as it was to many people, because a lot of people are broadly familiar with aspects of autism, like savant syndrome. You might remember the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman, based on a real life character. There are people in the autism spectrum who have photographic memories. If you recall, Dustin Hoffman's character was reading the pages of a phone book and then was later in a restaurant, and the server came and there was the server's name, and he looked and he said, whatever it was, Mary Jones, and gave her address and phone number, and she freaked out. What's going on here? Or there are others who have phenomenal mathematical skills. You could say what's 1,216 times 4,812, and you get an immediate answer as if you had asked a calculator. So we had glimpses of things like that, but we didn't know how to classify them. And now we're finally figuring out that there's a lot happening, and they at times have profound understanding of things. I've met some who speak like Old Testament prophets, and so it feels like the door has just started opening, and I'm still learning a lot from it.
So once you realized this about Cody and you were excited to have a conversation with him, what's one of the first things that you asked him about?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted him to speak. What are you interested in? What do you think about? What has your life been like? And y- the the initial lessons that someone like Cody gets is a process, and it's different for everybody. I met parents of one 10-year-old boy. They thought, this sounds interesting. They got him a spelling board, and he just immediately started spelling and talking, but others take longer to break in. Cody started with lessons, so he was asked questions about animals and if whatever was in the lesson, and he was answering them. And the breakthrough was a lesson about Wyatt Earp. And Wyatt Earp was described, where he was born, it's kind of his background. And he had a girlfriend who was hooked on a painkiller called laudanum, which was sort of a popular drug back then. And when he was asked that question, he spelled out, her name and that she was addicted to laudanum. And then out of nowhere, he added, drugs are a problem in our country today. So he wasn't just responding to a lesson now, he was thinking something. And the spelling facilitator said, well, can you tell me more about that? And he went on to say, drugs come over the border from the cartel. We need more border security. And his parents were in the room, or at least his mom was, and she thought, oh my goodness, he can not only answer questions, he knows things, he has opinions, and I've never known it. The most common reaction when that happens is people just start to cry. Cody at that point might have been 18 or 19, and, his parents are thinking, he's been there all this time, and we've not known. Fortunately, a lot of parents tend to talk up to their kids, the way we might with a baby, say. We know a 6-month-old doesn't understand what we're saying, but we get there's something about our voice and the words that's helping the brain to form. I think there might have been some of that happening that helped. And, everybody, I mean, it was maybe a couple months ago, I was in my church, and there was a boy 10 or 11 years old, and he was just baptized, and his dad went to the first session that the father had attended. The mother had gone to a few, and he was telling his mother immediately, "I see angels. Do you believe me?" And I've heard that now many, many, many times. And the mother went, "Whoa," and the spelling facilitator said, "Just call Joe. He'll," And so I went to that first session, and the father was sitting next to me. And the first thing the young boy spelled, and this is without making eye contact. We associate these conversations. I'm looking you in the eyes the whole time we're talking. The first thing he spelled was, "I love you, Dad." And father had never heard that. He was 10, 11 years old. The father had never heard that. And of course, the father starts crying. I start crying. And, it's contagious. So there's a kind of combination of regret and how did I not know this and why didn't I start sooner? And yet people get over it very quickly because every speller I've met is extraordinarily gracious and forgiving. "Mom, Dad, don't be upset. You didn't know I was in here." And so that part of the experience has been that part of the experience has been very gratifying. It's given me kind of a life mission now to do more for special needs, get this better known, raise money to help, even start getting more people to understand spelling, training more spellers, scholarshiping people, whatever we can do. I feel like this is something I want to do in this next stage of life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Wow. And you mentioned that child seeing angels, and I was going to ask you, I know you've said autism can remove certain filters. So can you unpack that a little? And what are the filters that we're talking about?
This is my effort to explain something. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. The way I've tried to address it with audiences is there's, and my theology has always been charismatic. I've always accepted and experienced gifts of the Spirit. They're not, somebody who has a cessationist view might have more difficulty with this. And yet, every human being I've met, if I'm in a room and I ask, how many of you have had that experience? You can't understand. The phone rings, you think of Aunt Sally, you pick it up as Aunt Sally. Everybody, without exception, has that. So I think there's a kind of communication means that happens. There's sort of energy, ultimately matter is energy, and energy can be converted into matter equals MC squared. And it's almost like there's just sort of this cosmic background that God's created. And this is my attempt to try to summarize what I've heard a few scientists say, and I don't know if they're accurate. I don't know if I'm necessarily saying what they say accurately, but I'll try. They say something like, we all have that potential. Cody has said to me many times, Joe, everyone can do this. You just don't do it because your senses are too distracting for you. And what they've said is, we live in a world where we need our senses to survive. I made myself breakfast this morning. You pick out clothes to wear, and you're interacting all the time with physical things. And so that tends to dull, another side of it. And it's like a lot of Christians struggle to have good devotional lives. And one of the things I hear a lot of from people is, I don't know, I sit there, I try to pray and listen, and all I can think about is what I have to do that day. Well, we get that. We're distracted by things. Learning to hear from God is a discipline. It takes time. There are studies that show that if someone is deprived of one sense, the brain is able to rewire in ways that help other senses compensate. So I mean, I've met one person over a Zoom call, and they introduced me to their daughter. Their daughter was born both blind and unable to speak. Her hearing is very, very sensitive, and her touch is very sensitive, and she's now spelling on a Braille keyboard. So certain sensors can compensate. Now, I don't know if maybe something is happening that when you get into the point that you're enough in the autism spectrum that it's not because you can't speak, it's that you're deep enough in a spectrum that you've lost the ability to speak effectively, but it affects other things. Um, you may not be able to ride a bike effectively. There are other things happening. It may be that the impact on the senses at that level just puts you more in tune with the spirit world. Virtually all of them I've met have said to me, from the time we were infants, we saw angels, could see demons, we've seen Jesus. He's talked to us and comforted us and told us his purposes for our lives, and we're supposed to be witnesses of him. And they never doubted that. I mean, I might have been thinking, yeah, but I have autism and I can't speak. I have no way to communicate. How am I going to be a witness for you? And yet, they never doubted for a moment. And they just got used to living in that world. And a lot of them have said to me, I just understood other people don't see what I see or experience what I experience. And you just learn to live that way.
Wow. So basically they're saying that we all have the ability to see these things and experience them, but we just are unable to because we haven't learned how to, because we are experiencing all of our senses and certain senses are more heightened for them.
Yeah, to different degrees. I think I saw an angel once. Um, I know people who say that they're able to see angels on occasions, or they they have visions. They've seen visions of heaven. It could be something that approximates what happens with near-death experiences, where people, kind of as their spirit is losing contact with the body, they're seeing other things. I know you've had guests on to kind of explore that a little bit. So I think there's something that happens. I don't understand it, but I've met people without autism who say, the problem is, how do you know if they're telling the truth? I have a tendency to believe everyone. That's just that's why I don't have. My wife has excellent discernment. Somebody will tell me something. I go, "Oh, that was great." My wife will go, "No, that's not. Something's not right with that one." Really? Oh, okay. But and there's no question people, will make things up or say things for attention. I have that kind of natural skepticism. I don't doubt spiritual gifts in the least. I live in that world. I experience them. I've been the recipient of them. I've had them work in my life for other people. I never doubted it. But what I'm skeptical of at times is whether people are being truthful or accurate about it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd love to talk about the hill. So basically, from my understanding, a lot of these kids who have never met each other describe meeting at the same place and describe similar details about that place that's called the hill. Can you tell us about the first time you heard about the hill and what your understanding of it is?
Yeah. So the first time I heard about the hill, we were doing a spelling session with Cody and two other young men named Houston and Josiah, both of whom have had books written about them. As I was uncovering what was happening in my church, I thought, oh my goodness, are we the only ones? Is anybody else seeing this? So I started researching it, and I found there were stories here and stories there. And so I started reaching out to some of the authors saying, help me. I'm seeing this in my church. What's going on here? And then I found it was kind of a network, and they introduced me to that network. And I started reading more on autism and what is it about and what's happening here. And so we had early spelling sessions where they were meeting each other. At the end of one, I believe it was Josiah said to Cody toward the end of the session, you should meet us on the hill tonight. And Cody responded, I'd like to go there, but it's so difficult to go and return to my body with its chains. The rest of us in the room sat there with intelligent looks on our face like this. What's going on here? So the next spelling session with Cody, we asked him, Josiah mentioned something about the hill. Can you tell us about that? And Cody's answer was ask, and he named his spelling facilitator, ask her. She's been there. So Cody's parents and I all looked at her, and I'm telling you, Natalie, I literally saw the color drain out of her face. And she said, about 10 years ago, I had a dream, a vision. I don't know what it was. I was on a hillside. It was like an actual hill with grass and things. And Jesus was there. And his face was so clear, and he was looking at me. His eyes were incredible. I couldn't take my eyes off of his eyes, and it was so powerful. And I prayed for years, please, whatever that was, let me have that experience again. And it's never happened again. And then, and Cody hears a lot from angels, and some things he can say and some things he can't, and they all hear from angels. The angels apparently are very talkative. And Cody then typed out to his facilitator, the children you saw there all had autism. And she went, that's right. There were children everywhere there. Oh my goodness. And he went on to give a few more details. And she asked, why was I allowed to see that? And he said, because God knew you would be working with people with autism and spelling, and he wanted you to know that what we see is real. The next day, another speller came in, Matthew, and he asked me, and they'll tell their parents, could you have Pastor Joe come? They often want me to pray with them, and they want to ask questions about things. So I went in, and Matthew and I talked about incense that they all smell when angels are fighting, and some other things. At the end of it, I said, Matthew, by the way, can you tell me about the hill? Are you allowed to talk about that? And Matthew said, ask, and he named the facilitator, ask her, she's been there. So we just kind of smiled at each other. A little after that, I went on the telepathy tapes, and this was before it became #1 in the world. The creator of it reached out because she had heard from some of the people in the network. Joe's been doing a dive into the science and the studies, and so she invited me on. I thought, well, I'll go. I didn't love the word telepathy, but I thought I'll just say what they're seeing. And she's an extremely talented filmmaker. She's making a documentary now and has had some of the guests back, including a few from, my church. And I thought, well, she might be interested in hearing about the hill. So I started telling her. And later when she did I think that first one was episode 7, she said how amused she was that she's been hearing about the hill for over a year and from hundreds of people. And here I was so excited. I just heard about it and I was telling her. So that I've since gotten more details about the hill. So put on your seatbelt. Your listeners are going to hear things that I haven't said anywhere publicly yet. There is apparently more than one hill. There are leaders on the hill. Josiah and Cody and Houston, all three have had books written about them now, are leaders on respective hills. Somebody with Down syndrome was spelling with me. The mother said, you have to see this and hear this. And the young man with Down syndrome mentioned going to the hill with Down syndrome. So now my brain is completely scrambled. It seems that it's not just autism. It might be some kind of provision from God for people who have challenges, bodily challenges, and there could be other conditions that allow that sort of ability to go there. So the hill, everybody talks about the flowers on the hill. The flowers are very important. The flowers give off light and energy. Elsa, my granddaughter, sort of, has given me more details than anyone. Um, the flowers in some way correspond to people for whom they are interceding. The energy has a distinct smell. It's a good smell, but she described it as like burnt energy. And it's a creative energy of God. There's incredible beauty. Everything there worships God. Again, a lot of similarities to the near-death experiences. Flowers and blades of grass worship God. Everything is musical. The angels are always worshiping. They hear the music in the background. So there's this perfect, just very blessed atmosphere, and everything is alive and full of this energy of God. And there's a sense of it, and I don't know the right word for it. There's a sense of the hill being something like a suburb of heaven. There's a sense that there's the city over there. And some of them, even describe the city. It seems like not many have been there. Some of the people with NDEs, the near-death experiences, talk about the wall is massive and they can see the river, and they can, they're aware that the throne of God, the Creator's enormous throne, is in there. A few say that they've seen it. Others have seen sort of this area, these outskirts, and there are fields and there are mountains and streams and kind of everything that we have in this world, they have there. I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan of the last volume of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Last Battle, when the young heroes have finally passed and they're entering eternity, which for them is also Narnia. They're racing by and they're seeing mountains and they're going, oh, that's what God meant when he showed us mountains. Now we get it. That's what, oh, that's what a river was meant to be. Wow. And so it's like the things on earth are pale imitations of what God's created in paradise. So some of them have glimpses of that, not all of them, but the hill, that seems to be an awareness that this is a part of the greater creation that God has in store for us. Paul says, eye has not seen, ears not heard what God has prepared for those, who love him. So you have these kinds of, elements in their stories as well. So there, again, seem to be more than one hills. And then there's even adjacent areas like fields. I have a few chapters in the book about Brooke Brown, and I included her because Brooke is an honors graduate of Arizona State University. She's an author. She's a motivational speaker. She is also Miss Arizona Wheelchair, was born with a severe cerebral palsy. Her speech is difficult to follow. It's always been that way. I can understand things sometimes. She communicates through a speaking advice. She gave her graduation speech to her class, to the first standing ovation in the history of the school. So Brooke was Miss Arizona Wheelchair and then was in the Miss U.S. Wheelchair pageant, and her theme was always assume competence. And that's an important theme I think we have to get out. That applies not only to my spellers with autism, but people with special needs more broadly. I feel like we've missed something important as a church. You and I know that every human being is an image bearer of God, but it's one thing to know, it's another thing to kind of really feel it and process it in a way that makes it real and understand the value that God sees in these precious people. We've missed it, and they seem to be a provision for us. And I had Brooke on a podcast, and at the end of it, she talked about her sweet times of intimacy with Jesus. And then I was rethinking that, and I thought, well, I wonder if something has happened. So I emailed her to ask, when you said that, I thought you were just talking like in general. Have you actually seen things? And she wrote back and said, yeah, I don't really talk about it, but since you're hearing about it with the individuals, with autism, and she proceeded to tell me, and I added a chapter in the book, Brooke's Vision of Jesus. And she describes this kind of place. Gold seems to be the prominent color. The fields are gold, the streets are translucent, pure gold, as John describes in Revelation. And she's there with Jesus, and they dance. And she talks about the incredible joy, that she's experienced there. And so this has gotten, again, this has me thinking that this may be a broader phenomenon where God just gives a grace to people who live with special challenges. And again, we're all still learning this, but I'm seeing evidence that that's more the case, and autism maybe just be one type of that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And maybe for people with special needs, it's hard for them to meet him in their conscious living day to day, depending on what their challenges are. But in their dreams or when they go to the hill, it sounds like all of that is lifted. And that's when they truly have this very special relationship with Jesus that most of us have not experienced on this earth. So that's just amazing. So then the hill, it's somewhere they go in their dreams, correct? So then when they're not dreaming, are they able to telepathically hear or understand things? Are they seeing angels when they're not asleep?
Yeah,
How
they
does
see
that work?
angels all the time. And they say they go to the hill at night. So by that, we've kind of assumed that it's in their sleep. There may be some ability to go, even more generally, I don't know. But yeah, they go there, and the greatest thing for them, the hill, is freedom of communication. All speech is just thought. It's immediately understood, and they have friends, and they look forward to seeing their friends. The telepathy tapes recorded, episodes of somebody in this city talking about their friend in that city, and someone in that city talking about their friend in this city. And a few times the sources on the telepathy tape tried to track them down and found that it was true. So they meet there, they have these friendships. They also get work assignments. It's not just hanging out. They are part of what God is doing in this world. A number of them have told me that they are heralds, that they're here to talk about God's desires for the world. Many of them will say, Jesus is coming quickly. And again, there are some overlapping themes with not only near death experiences, but even accounts we hear of Muslims and Jesus appearing to Muslims in dreams and visions. There seem to be similarities in how overwhelmingly Jesus presents as love. He's the manifest presence of the love of the Father, for us. So, but to your question, yeah, sometimes they're at the hill, but it seems like constantly they are aware of the spirit world around us, that it probably interacts, or we interact with, much more than we realize. And so they'll see angels, they'll see demons, they've seen them fight. They describe even the fighting. They at times will see many, many angels. They'll see angels with particular people for particular purposes. So that seems to be ongoing. That's not so much the hill as it is they would be sitting and talking to you, and while they're talking to you, they're able to simultaneously see, you know, there's a second screen behind you, and they're able to see the angel there protecting you. So that happens all the time.
So interesting. Have they given you any details about like each person has an assigned guardian angel or they see certain demons at certain places or anything very specific like that?
Yeah, there's some of that. I wish I could have gone into more detail at it in the first book. This is what it looks like, by the way. You can, that's sort of the hill there. I wish I could have. I felt in the first book I had to focus on the credibility. Why should anyone even believe this? What is autism about? Why should we think they're telling the truth? Maybe they are trying to get attention, or there's motives to lie or something like that, or they're not seeing things accurately. So I didn't get to go into quite as much as I wanted to, but they'll often see the same angel with the same person, but not always. And there are times there are multiple angels. The spelling facilitator who works with the ones in our church, very lovely, down to earth, a woman just so humble, so gracious. She always has an angel. She's the only human being who ever has who always has an angel with her. But there were days that, one day, all the spellers came in, and they don't communicate. They don't own phones, they don't text, they can't call. One day all of them came in and said, "Oh, you have 2 angels today. There's a heavy attack," and they described it. And then a little after that, there were 4 angels. One day, over a course of 2 days, all the spellers came in and said, "The room is filled with angels." How many? Too many to count. Why? You need extra protection. And they even understood, you're going to be ill and this is going to happen. I've had that happen with me where from angels, they knew things were going on, things I hadn't told anybody. I mean, it's happened so frequently now, I don't even keep track of them anymore. When there was an earlier version of the book, I sent it to Cody's, parents, and Gloria's mom was reading it. They were on vacation and they were sitting in a room and it was late. And she's reading, and as she's reading, Cody's in another part of the room, and he suddenly says aloud, excuse me, Elisha, not Elijah. And Glory thinks, well, that's strange. I don't know. So she goes back to the book. The next paragraph, I'm talking about biblically, do people see angels? Is there that dimension? Can it be opened up? And I'm writing about Elisha and his servant outside the city of Dothan, where the servant is frightened. And Elisha says, "Lord, open his eyes. There's more with us than with the enemies surrounding the city." And the servant is able to see the hillside is covered with chariots of fire, angelic beings, and all of that. So she went, "Oh my goodness." So the next time she was spelling with Cody, she said, "Why did you say Elisha?" And he said, "Jesus told me you were reading about Elisha, and I wanted you to know that I really do see angels." Here's another thing. I've been in the faith since 1978. I've had a lot of interesting spiritual experiences. The first time I was spelling with some people the first time this happened, I was spelling with some people online. They were, other people who have been the subject of books and things. And we were on a session, and toward the end of it, a young man started spelling something. And his mom said, "Oh, he's saying to tell you that Jesus told him to tell you you're supposed to be training pastors and ministers on how to understand this." Now, Natalie, I've been around a while. I've never heard Jesus said. you know,
Yeah.
we talk about the Holy Spirit, or we'll talk about this or that, and we're sort of,
Right.
I'm appropriately cautious. And, I mean, I didn't even know what to say. I thought, well, okay, oh, well, thank you. And I went home that night, and I was praying, and I thought, "Lord, was that really you?" It's like, "I've never seen you." I've never, like, is that was that real? And right after that, his mom emailed me and said, "He said to write to you to say he wanted you to know, yes, it was real." So those those kinds of things happen now. Well, this is my world these days. And, yeah,
Wow.
so they see these things, and they all see Jesus. I should wait for another question, but I just wanna lead with this. I've asked many of them to describe Jesus, and every one of them, without exception, gives some variation of this answer: "He looks like love. He is God's love for us." If you and I were having a conversation, I go, "Okay, describe that person." What do we typically say? I mean, 6 foot. You know, she has brown hair, or whatever. They all go to the essence of who Jesus is. They are riveted by his eyes. They say there's something about his eyes that when you make eye contact with him, you feel like you are the only human being in existence. He knows you so fully and totally and utterly. You feel how profoundly loved you are. He's not angry at you for the things you did wrong. He's your biggest fan. He's he's
Yeah.
rooting for you in every way. And again, that's common with near-death experiences. People who see Jesus are overwhelmed by just a sense of love in his presence. So they all see that. And even in questions of should we believe these things, I lined everything up biblically. I said in the beginning of this, Lord, if this doesn't line up biblically, I'm not going near it. and everything lines up, and they'll say to you, "Jesus is the way the Father has provided for us to be reconciled to him. He's the image of the Father for us. He came from the Father. Our sins are forgiven through him." So they're thoroughly biblical. The latest episode I'm trying to now work through, and I'm not ready to draw any conclusions yet, is there are non-Christians at times on the Hill, and what exactly they see or experience is still hard to know. And the best way I've been able to think of it so far is John Burke's latest book on near-death experiences is Imagine the God of Heaven, and he dealt with that 'cause he's talked to, like, 1,500 people with near-death experiences, and he talked about meeting some who were, Hindu or Muslim, whatever, and he said they see the same things, but they don't always interpret them the same way. And he said there's oddities like, I'm gonna paraphrase, I wasn't planning on commenting on this. Like, he would say, well, that, a Hindu said, "Oh, I floated off out of my body. There was light. There was such joy and peace. I saw this figure of light." And, one of them might say, it was Shiva. Well, I know a little bit about Hindu mythology, as he does. Shiva is multi-headed and vicious, and, there were human sacrifices to Shiva and all that. So, yet they had a similar kind of experience. So it's hard to know what to make of some of this. I'm optimistic and hopeful that God appears to people in ways we don't understand, that his mercy goes further than we can contemplate. It's not, "Oh, I recited the spiritual prayer that somebody gave me, so now I'm in. I got my, fire insurance." I think it's something much more profound happening. One person told me a story. I wanna be careful. This person had a friend, who was Hindu, and they worked with this person, and the child, was near death and had autism. And sometimes autism is accompanied by seizure disorders or other, physical problems. And she went to pray for this young boy, and she told me she just sometimes sees visions. She's awake, she's not asleep, and she sees visions. And she was there, and the child's parents weren't there at that particular moment, and she started praying for this boy, and as she did, she said she suddenly had a vision. She was in it. They just come on her. She doesn't do anything to make them happen. And in the vision, the boy was his spirit was just standing there, just whole and smiling and beautiful, and she looked, and over next to him, she saw Jesus. And, they came together, and they were talking. She couldn't hear what was being said, and at the end of it, I'm sorry, now I'm getting choked up a little. At the end of it, the boy just looked at her and said, "Thank you for praying and introducing me to Jesus." And hours later, the boy was, passed. So what God does in the last moments of a person's life, we could look to the thief on the cross. Luke's version, we're told, just right before his death, "Lord, remember me when you enter your kingdom. I tell you this day you'll be with me in paradise." There was no formal prayer or no understanding of God like we might say we have now, but, you know, scripture says man looks at the outward part, God sees the heart. So there's
Yeah.
Jesus seeing the heart of that man, desperate, life flowing out of his body, ebbing second by second in the most
Mhm.
painful way imaginable, and there's the mercy of God meeting him. So it gives me hope that God's be doing more in these situations than we know.
Right, yeah, and I've heard a lot of NDEs where, they say they were headed towards hell or in the deep, dark abyss, and they knew where they were going, and they had never called on the name of Jesus in their life, but in something in them made them say, "Jesus, save me," and that's the second that they got snatched up and,
Right.
came back to, and so, yeah, we never know what happens in those final moments. I've heard someone else who explained that they had a friend who was, like, very adamant atheist, and on their deathbed, this Christian person was next to them and just was whispering in their ear, "Just call on Jesus, just call on Jesus." And she said something in her spirit, like, told her she's calling on Jesus and, she's saved. And so that's not for us to know, or
Right.
understand, but yeah, I do think, God is merciful, and it's not anything we do, it's what Jesus did on the cross, and, um,
Right.
we just need to
Absolutely.
to believe, and even if it's in our very last moment, even after we're gone and maybe not fully dead yet, I don't understand how that works, but I do think there's some of that going on, that after people are physically dead, there might be a moment before their spirit or their soul is in heaven or hell where they're able to call on Jesus,
Yeah.
so,
I've
yeah,
been intrigued by those same stories, and who knows? Time doesn't exist for God.
right,
We live in a space-time
right,
continuum, and, God is in eternity. Who's
yeah,
to say that there's not that last second when a person is dying that God presents something? And we understand, you know, I believe, fully in the scripture. It's authoritative, it's inerrant. I'm totally on board. I'm orthodox in every way. Everybody is saved through Jesus Christ. Is it and only through Jesus Christ? Is it possible someone can be saved through Jesus Christ without knowing it? Well, I think the biblical foundation we have that could allow something like that is, well, we see King David and Moses in heaven, of course. How were they saved and reconciled to God? By Jesus Christ. How could that be when they didn't know, they hadn't met him? And, so God gave retroactive application. They looked forward in faith to Messiah. So I mean, there may be ways that God gives effect to something. And you read some of these NDEs that people have had horrible, horrible lives. I mean, let alone not exposed to faith. I mean, growing up in patterns of violence and abuse and all these things. And God sees those things. He knows the heart that's in there and how to reach him. So it gives me hope. I really believe God's mercy will extend to the absolute limits of his sovereignty dictates, that, is perfect. And I really think that in eternities, nobody's going to be asking questions like, how come this one? Or I like when people say, when I get there, I'm going to ask God this. I,
yeah.
I say, you ain't asking anything. When you get there, you're gonna be so overwhelmed with
Mm,
the presence of God and the beauty of eternity, that you'll understand those things, you won't need to. And I think we'll be able to see how far God's grace and love really went, and we didn't appreciate it enough in this life.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we need to wrap up our time here, so I'd love to just ask you, what pushback or skepticism have you received from the Christian community in telling Cody's story and the story of so many others? And what do you think the church should be working towards today?
Yeah. So the three categories theologians use are sort of charismatic and Pentecostal. They have some distinctives, but lumping them together. A second category, people who they call open, but cautious. And then a third category, they're cessationists, the gifts have ceased, and all of that. So some of it, from the cessationist camp, there might be people who say, well, those things don't happen. But I may have friends and we've talked about those things. And, I've tried to say, look, be careful. Remember, the religious leaders of Jesus's day were saying, wait a minute, the Gentiles, God doesn't do that. And we need to be very careful about putting God in a box and saying, I have this figured out. To me, it approaches arrogance to say, God can't be doing that because I don't see that happening. I'm not talking about people make errors like they deny the divinity of Jesus or the Trinity or things. I'm talking about the way that God might be working in a particular time. So there's been some of that. But there are real questions that, like some people say, well, wait a minute, Old Testament, we're told you can't contact the dead and all of those things. And so, and that's a real question. That's a serious question. The way I process that is, that's right. told not to do that. We should not be going to seances. We shouldn't be, doing things. Those are obviously, kind of uh, nests for demonic activity. That doesn't mean those things can never happen. Most Bible scholars agree when Saul wanted to speak to Samuel, it seems Samuel himself appeared. So it's not inconceivable that those things can happen. We're just not supposed to look to them for signs. And nobody's doing that. Nobody's saying, oh, help me talk to my grandmother. Everything about what they're doing is about Jesus. It's all about the gospel. In fact, one of the most common answers Cody gives people is you need to pray about that and ask God and trust Him and read your Bible. They do not want to be vending machines or commodities. They're always talking about you need to get closer to God. And I hear that from multiple spellers. And to me, that's refreshing. That's like a mark of authenticity. So I like to point out I've never seen scripture violated. There's no reason to believe that God doesn't have angels appear to people and give messages. The Bible's full of them. Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, and then Mary and Joseph, and on and on. An angel goes to Peter in prison, and you find it's always through the Bible to the point that angelos or agelos, the word now means messenger, but angels provide much more than that. Those functions, they fight, they worship. But they're so associated in the scripture with appearing to people with messages that word kind of blends together. So we tend to import our biases into this. I think we need to be more open. And when this was first happening, I went into trial lawyer mode. I started thinking, okay, if these were witnesses and I was cross-examining, what would the motives be? I discovered lots of surprising things. Like, this is well verified. People with autism are among the most honest people you will ever meet. Some go even further and say they're incapable of lying. That doesn't seem to be the case, but it's difficult for them to lie. And there seems to be a consensus in the community that it's nearly impossible for them to sustain and build on a lie. And so you go through like, okay, why might people lie? People would lie for money, right? That's an obvious one. They're disconnected from money. What they have gets put in a special needs trust, by their families. They don't have access, they're, without some sort of divine intervention. They're not going to have a credit card or thing. People lie for attention. It's extraordinary, but that they dislike attention. And I'm generalizing here. People with autism, typically well into the spectrum, are characterized by difficulty speaking, not making eye contact, repetitive motion, difficulty with emotions is a common feature of autism. Lots of attention is unwelcome. I went on autism sites and read conversations on people higher functioning, talking about how much they hated the attention. It reminded them when they were young and they were ridiculed and they stood out. And yeah, I hide in a closet on my birthday. I don't want people to look at me. And they're a unique group of people who don't want attention. So I kind of went into some of those sorts of things. And like everything comes up, oh my goodness, they're believable. And then we see they say the same things the same days. They're biblical. They know what's going to happen sometimes. They know what people are thinking. There's a telepathy. I met Elsa's dad, John, wonderful guy. And he came to me and when I first met him, he wasn't a Christian. And he said, I don't know what to make of this. And Elsa she sees things and I see it. And she keeps warning me about being careful. I'm going to slip on ice and get badly injured. And he said, sorry, but, we're in Phoenix. We don't see a lot of ice here. And I had the privilege of leading him to the Lord. And it's interesting. He went home and Elsa spelled to her mom. She just looked in his direction and said, Jesus is with Dad. We'll see him in heaven, without her knowing anything that we had prayed. And then maybe a month later, he was on a business trip in the Midwest, and it was winter, and he texted me from his a hospital room. He said, "You're not gonna believe this. I was going back. I slipped on ice like she said. I broke my hip. They're putting hardware in it." He even texted me images of the radiographs, the X-rays. And so you see all these things and you realize, if God is doing something special, am I going to say, "No, God's not really speaking to people through near-death experience. He's not really speaking to Muslims," because I don't see that here. Boy, we need a much better measure of humility, and we're trying to capture more of these things. If people have questions, they can reach out to me. One way they reach out is on Instagram. They can just go on Instagram at Pastor Joe Infranco. It's Infranco. They can email me at church, jinfranco, J-I-N Nancy, Franco, at highlandschurch.org. Or they can go on the website. We formed a new nonprofit, Cody's parents and myself, called Hidden Gifts Ministry. And our goal, and just so you know, I'm not here to sell a book. Everything from the book is going into the ministry. No individual is making any money from it. Hiddengiftsministry.org. We're putting free resources for people, even things like, when the parents get the diagnosis, what do we do? Are there education? Are there government benefits? We're trying to anticipate everything. We're trying to help churches start or expand special needs ministries. We're trying to help people get better informed about spelling, where to connect with spelling facilitators. We want to minister to marriages. Matt and Glory do marriage counseling. Without some kind of intervention, couples who get the special needs diagnosis have a divorce rate approaching 90%. People are just not equipped to deal with the stresses of marriage and now having children, but also a special needs child. You imagine a child, you can't go out to a restaurant or a movie because I have a new friend, Mary Tudorow, who is heart of a caregiver. We've linked to some of her stuff. Her daughter, Hootie is a nickname, has autism and multiple seizures every day. And she's been caring for her daughter for, I think it's about 30 years now. And she was a TV anchor woman, and she left that, and she left everything. And we're trying to find the people who are doing it, and we're trying to reach families and to get people to see, not only are these people with special needs image bearers of God, it turns out, in the weird, inverted way, in the paradoxes of God, they're a blessing and a provision for us. They're talking about things that are astonishing. They're insights and spiritual truths and all that, and we've just missed them. I missed them. We don't need to beat ourselves up over it. We just need, now it's time to do better. It's time to see people differently. The word for repentance, metanoia, means literally to think differently, a change of thinking. We think of, somebody on the street corner, repent, and no, when we think differently, our actions follow. When we start seeing people differently and seeing the treasures that God's built into them, we're going to want to do more. And I think we want to recognize the provision that God's given and how much He loves them. I signed a lot of the books with Matthew 25:40. What you've done for the least of these, you've done for me. We have to invert our thinking and start seeing what God's built for us as provision.
Wow. And something that's so amazing is that Cody said God, and I think a few of the people you work with said this, but that God has given them a mission to bear witness. And look at what's happening through your book and through all that's coming out on, the telepathy tapes and just all the work that's being done with these children now. I mean, they are sure bearing witness to the world, and yeah,
Yeah.
it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, they all say that. In fact, when I was first considering writing a book, and I felt in my spirit that something like that was going to happen, not knowing what it was. Cody a couple of times said, "Just so you know, there'll be attacks. Demons hate that this book is being written." I said, "Whoa, that's interesting. Why?" Well, one, they want to be kept secret, and two, they don't want people seeing others with special needs as image bearers of God and understanding what God is doing through their lives. And the other thing he said on occasion was, "The angels are really happy that you're doing this. They say keep going." So I thought, I wonder if I could get like a cover blurb, like I don't know, is there, like, some angel around?
Yeah, someone you
No,
can
I'm
quote
I'm
on the back
just
of your
I'm
book.
I'm just joking. Right, right. But no, the whole thing has been an amazing spiritual adventure, and, they keep telling us, "We're praying for you. This was supposed to happen. This is the season." And I'm just waiting to see what God does with it and trying not to mess it up.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. And sorry, I have one more quick question. Do you have a
I have
second?
plenty of time.
Okay, okay, thank you. I know, when I heard you on somewhere else, I can't remember if it's Cody or a different child you worked with, but you explained a situation where their grandmother died, and it was before they were spelling, so they couldn't communicate what was happening. But could you tell us about that
Yeah,
situation?
that was Cody.
Okay.
Um, Cody's grandmother, Glory's mom, died when Cody was a little boy. Glory was in the room watching her mother, and, she was at that point where the breath they knew she was going to pass that day. The breathing is getting shallower, and you know that death is imminent. And they put the boys in the other room, and Cody was a little boy. And, at the moment her mother, passed, the breathing stopped. Glory was looking down at her mom and just knowing she was gone. And Cody went running into the room. Remember, he has limited speech, but he can get a few words out at times. And he was so excited and jumping up and down, and he was saying, "Bye bye, Grandma. See you in heaven, Grandma. Bye bye, Grandma. Bye bye, Grandma." And Glory just looked and thought, "Oh my goodness." So years later, after spelling, she remembered the story, and she asked him, "You remember when Grandma died?" And he knew the date. He gave the date. And that's often a feature of non-speaking autism, that there's extraordinary ability to remember dates and details, and he gave the date. And, Glory asked Cody about it, and he said, "I saw Jesus come, and Jesus took grandma." He said, "You were in the room, Mom." And he was not in the room when this happened. "You were there, Mom. You were very sad, and, but you didn't see. Grandma was so happy. She was seeing Jesus, and Jesus was taking her with him, and it's gonna be okay. You'll see her again in heaven." But that explanation came many years later.
Yeah, that's so cool, and it was so comforting to me to just hear from somebody who could see and sense what was going on, and that, your loved one, who knows Jesus, they're extremely happy in that moment.
Yeah, well, we grieve too. We grieve, but not as those who have no hope. But
Right.
like every MDE that you read about, right? Do you wanna go back? No, no. But then occasionally there's "But I'm worried about my children," or this or that, and so but nobody happily comes back after getting a taste of eternity.
Amazing. Joe, thank you for sharing your incredible testimonies with us and the work that you're doing. It's just incredible and faith building and just gets me more excited to learn more and more about God through his word and see how these things actually go together. And so
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you. And it's
Well,
important work that
thank
you're
you.
doing.
Been an absolute delight to be with you, and I'm still learning. I might I might revisit with you in 6 months and say, "Okay, forget this part of it," So, I mean, we'll see what
Yeah.
God does with it.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear any updates. So let me know and we'd love to have you back on.
Sure thing. Blessings to you.